You cannot easily fit women into a structure that is already coded as male, you have to change the structure. One of the great things about history is that it sort of isn't a done deal, ever. The historical texts and the historical evidence that you use is always somehow giving you different answers because you're asking it different questions. My mother took me to the British Museum aged 5. I had thought people from the past weren't as good as we were, and then I saw the Elgin marbles. Suddenly, the world seemed more complicated. One person's barbarity is another person's civilization. What politicians do is they never get the rhetoric wrong, and the price they pay is they don't speak the truth as they see it. Now, I will speak truth as I see it, and sometimes I don't get the rhetoric right. I think that's a fair trade-off. When it comes to silencing women, Western culture has had thousands of years of practice. Greek myths, early Roman history, is configured around violence against women. And I think we need to get in there, get our hands dirty, face it, and see why and how it was. People who exploit others come to spend an enormous amount of energy wondering about and justifying that exploitation. We lived in the schoolhouse of the village school in Church Preen, in deepest Shropshire, and my mum was the schoolmistress. She taught the juniors, and one other teacher taught the infants. I went there from the age of 3, no doubt as a form of childcare. The reason why the British theatrical tradition is world-leading in Greek drama is because there is a flourishing tradition of people rethinking Greek tragedy. Beard's secret is always to be slightly on the edge but to pull back from disaster at the last minute. I have lots of heroes and heroines, mostly unsung and including my husband. Roman military tactics were much overrated. All the clever ones had the same idea, which was to go round the back. The thing about being a university teacher is that you're fairly tolerant about young people saying things they shouldn't have said. What is the role of an academic, no matter what they're teaching, within political debate? It has to be that they make issues more complicated. The role of the academic is to make everything less simple. Whatever you say about popular culture, people like people who know things, who are experts, and it doesn't particularly matter what they look like. I have always thought the women's movement traded too much on outrage and not enough on ridicule. I don't want to see a world in which women can communicate on Twitter, but their actual voices are not heard. The building blocks of discrimination tend to be similar wherever you find them. A lot of sexism is just very silly, and the best response is laughter and ridicule. If talking about arts means being pretentious, a bit like being a wine critic, then I don't feel comfy with that. You can get a lot from paintings without getting mystical about brush strokes. English country towns are often seen as a cultural wasteland, but the more cut off you are, the more the need to create things, to make your own culture. When I am making a TV show, I am looking for engagement, not admiration. It would have been nice if the people who were criticizing civilizations had actually watched it. But the popular response has been tremendous, and in the end, that's what really matters. Playing around with other people's husbands when you were 17 was bad news. Yes, I was a very naughty girl. It wasn't until I got to Cambridge that I discovered active discrimination against women. I remember plastering the kitchen with Black Power pictures of Angela Davis. I'm actually in a tradition of classicists with a big public face who like sounding off. I was really good at Latin at school, and because I was good at it, I got more interested and got better at it. We make two mistakes about the ancient world. One is to assume they were better than us, that, for instance, the ancient Olympics didn't involve money-making. The opposite mistake, and just as common, is to think our Olympics are much more civilized than ancient sporting competitions. Neither is true. I loved Gladiator, and I thought its depiction of gladiatorial combat, although it was an aggrandizing picture, was cleverly and expertly done. I think you have to realize that most ancient warfare is really kind of hit and run, honestly. You go and you bash down the walls of some enemy 50 miles away and you take some slaves, you take some cattle, probably a bit of cash too, and then you say goodbye and go home, and you probably do the same thing next year, or try to, or they do it to you. No women in ancient Rome ever had the vote. Nobody but an idiot would pretend that they had an error-proof way of choosing the best out of hundreds of perfectly qualified applicants, not for university or for anything. In real life, Oxford and Cambridge are two excellent universities, like many others in the country. They are full of highly intelligent, hard-working, and quite ordinary students and teachers. I receive something we might euphemistically call an inappropriately hostile response, that is to say, more than fair criticism or even fair anger, every time I speak on radio or television. What I find very interesting is, we're not enthralled by the ancient world, and we've escaped all kinds of ancient preconceptions and assumptions and prejudices. But, nevertheless, we still make that connection between authoritative speech and male speech. Gender is a key marker of power and powerlessness. Most of the structures of how our world works are biased in terms of men. For whatever reason, some sorts of women's silence were broken by Me Too. This is the optimistic bit, and that will lead to a much more careful attention to women's voices. I'm not in the slightest wanting to attack the women's movement here, but I think that in popular, broadly left-wing, broadly feminist discourse, there is a tendency to just label discrimination against women, and embedded assumptions about them, as misogyny and think, job done. I think most people gain some sense of how to look at a painting, but no one ever teaches you how to look at a piece of silver. History is how we have learned to think about ourselves. It's not as though the Greeks and Romans are static entities out there to be discovered and translated. We make them speak, we talk to them, and they inform what we say. There is nothing inherently conservative in the ancient world. One of the downsides of working in antiquity is that you don't have many female voices, but you certainly have a lot of male terror about the potential of women's power. It shows you very clearly that the most oppressive cultures tend to be afraid of those whom they oppress. I'd quite like to be in Caligula's court, living in the back room somewhere and just being able to observe. I used to think that the British press were particularly awful to Sherry Blair. I think Blair's foreign policy was a complete disaster, but the British press, when they wanted to explain why Blair took unexpected moves, they did create Sherry as the power behind the throne. What interests me is the idea that classics is actually quite democratic. It isn't only the tough, upper-class subject it's often thought to be. Every generation enjoys rediscovering it. You can't always worry about offending people. I have always hated fancy dress parties. I was not much good as a waitress. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.